I mean, it wasn't Lamar Jackson electric, right? It wasn't
right.
Holmes electric, but it was like, wow.
What's up, everybody? Trevor Sikkema here, welcoming you into a new video series that we have here over at TDN's YouTube channel called Bust or Broken. Okay, the premise behind this series, which we're going to have a couple of episodes here that we get into because there's a lot of topics that we need to discuss here. We're going to look at some notable prospects that turned into pros where their situations didn't exactly work out for them, no matter how high they were drafted. Could be a top 5 pick, just a first round pick. Really, it doesn't matter. Just a highly regarded player who, let's say their NFL careers or their early NFL careers didn't pan out so well. So we want to know, is this prospect a bust, or did the team that drafted them break them? We know that fit matters a lot towards a lot of these prospects, and so sometimes that goes into the consideration. It's just that it's not always that these guys are just bums, and we are here to get to the bottom of it. We have a great one to kick off the series. With me, I have Lorin Cox of Locked On Bears, also Pro Football Focus as their social work over there. We're talking about Mitch Trubisky. That's the quarterback that we're talking about. You knew we had to start off with a quarterback. And so, Lorin, I really appreciate you joining me for this maiden voyage here to talk about Trubisky because we got a lot to get to, man. This is an interesting topic.
Yeah, I'm honored to be the first one. I didn't know heading in that I would be the first one, so I'll try and keep it gentle here for you. But yeah, it's a polarizing prospect from day one that still, I guess, 4 years later, still equally polarizing in Chicago.
I guess I forgot to tell you that you were the first one, but I wanted you to make sure that you didn't have any nerves for it because you were the right man for the job to talk about Trubisky. So let's get right to it. Let's talk about draft night when he initially came to the Chicago Bears because, you know, this was only a one-year starter coming out of North Carolina, but everybody talked about the quarterback rating. I think he had the highest quarterback rating of any quarterback in that class, so he's very highly touted. It's like, okay, this guy just came into a starter. He's already hitting the ground running with UNC. Figured that was going to be the same case in Chicago. They trade up to number 2, and we don't have to get into the trade-in part of them moving up one spot to go get Trubisky, but give me your thoughts on draft night. What did you think of Mitchell Trubisky when it happened? Because, of course, everybody knows this is the draft class with Patrick Mahomes, with Deshaun Watson. What were your thoughts when they took Trubisky at 2?
Yeah, when they were trading up, I remember the feeling it was like, oh, well, they want to make sure they get Solomon Thomas or whoever they were going to go with, Jamal Adams. They thought maybe San Francisco was going to take them, and they had to make that swap to make sure that they got the defensive player of choice. So, of course, when it was Mitch Trubisky, it was a surprise, but it wasn't as though at the time that Trubisky was this out of nowhere pick, right? I think when we look back, a lot of NFL draft analysts had Trubisky as the number 1 quarterback in that draft. I personally was a little bit more of a Deshaun Watson guy, but I wasn't ready to touch Patrick Mahomes with a 10-foot pole, at least not at that 3rd or 2nd overall pick.
It's okay to admit that. Patrick Mahomes is kind of crazy, Texas Tech.
The Chiefs obviously knew what they were getting into, but I think a lot of us didn't quite expect the Patrick Mahomes that we've seen. So, when it was Mitch, it was like, okay, they just signed Mike Glennon. He's going to be their starter for this first year. That's a whole other Bears quarterback discussion. But it was like, okay, the Bears could sit Mitch for a year behind Mike Glennon, at least a year. And, they had the Adam Gase offense with John Fox, a veteran coach that can bring the quarterback along slowly. Maybe he's going to need some work, but if you see only 1 year and these big flashes of that 1 year, you can give him some time and hope that becomes something greater and, maybe eliminate some of those flaws that you saw that were maybe just from a first-year quarterback without a lot of experience. And maybe at the time we were overlooking some of the negatives of why he was only a 1-year starter and why it took him that long to take over that starting role at North Carolina. As great as he was, there's some real questions that we needed to ask there that some people were asking, but I don't think we were putting enough weight behind.
I know a lot of scouts talk about games played and games started. That's often where the scouting sheet begins. You got the name, what year they are as a junior, senior, but you also talk about games played, games started. And so that's something that they note, I think, for a reason. So then his first year, we get into the first year. Mitch, you mentioned the coaching staff that he had there in his first year because it wasn't his coaching staff for long, but Mike Glennon started that year, I think, for 4 games, right? Yeah. And then Mitch took over for a little bit. When he took over, what was the vibe around it? I know he lost that first game. I think it was a Monday Night Football game, which was the first one that he kind of came in. But what was the vibe once he took over in that rookie season?
Electricity is the word that comes to mind because he brought that mobility, and it was such a stark contrast from the giraffe in the pocket that was Mike Glennon. I mean, it was electric. I mean, it wasn't Lamar Jackson electric, right? It wasn't
right.
Holmes electric, but it was like, wow, Chicago has a mobile quarterback with a big arm that can, he can throw, he can make all the throws. There was never a question from the arm talent standpoint, but early on in the first game, I think he led a comeback effort toward the end that fell a little bit short. And a couple of weeks later, I get mixed up if it was the Ravens or the Vikings. He led a fourth quarter comeback it was sort of like, okay, maybe the Bears have something here. There were still flaws, right? He was not this perfect, pristine quarterback. He still
but he was a rookie, right?
Yeah, he was a rookie. He played like a rookie quarterback. There were missed throws. There were some questionable interceptions late in those games because he's trying to force those and trying to be a hero and trying to make those plays. Absolutely. But it felt like there was something there, despite, a wide receiver core that was, I think, Kendall Wright and Dontrell Inman and a bunch of guys that, they're okay wide receivers, but they didn't have a number one and arguably didn't have a number two. It was a lot of number threes and number fours. And they, the running game was still kind of coming together. They had Jordan Howard running well, but there was a transition period certainly coming there. So it was kind of a weird end of a weird season, but it felt like the beginning of something starting to come together for Mitch Trubisky. Some justification of why he was drafted so early, but also some acknowledgement of why he still has some room to grow.
And then that was a big slingshot into year two, which is the year that, they changed the coaching staff, and we definitely need to get into the details of that. But under Matt Nagy in his first year, they go 12-4. I know the defense is a big reason for that. Defense is incredible. Yes. It was the number one defense in the NFL, but they go 12-4. Mitch, I believe as a starter, he started 14 games. He went 11-3 as a starter. And so you talk about having that electricity and that hope in that rookie year. I mean, they turned that into a division title the year after. Was it all sunshine and rainbows that second year, or was there even moments of doubt that started to creep in his sophomore year?
Yeah, as we move forward in this conversation, to think about 2018 or the offseason leading into that season, it was sort of the offseason about Mitch Trubisky, right? It's like, okay, everything we do from here on out needs to be supporting this quarterback. And the results of actually doing that are mixed, and it plays into this discussion, but they hired the offensive-minded head coach to support Mitch. They brought in, the whole conversation during head coaching interviews is, what are you going to do with Mitch Trubisky? How are you going to maximize our young quarterback?
Which, when we talk about like the bust or broken thing, I mean, that sounds like a team doing everything they can to help out their young quarterback. So at least the mindset was there with what they were going with Nagy.
Correct. Trying everything they can, I think, is the key word there, because the doing was more of a challenge. But right, that's why they hired Matt Nagy over some of the other coaches they were looking at, and why they go in and bring in Allen Robinson to be his number one wide receiver. And there were some other changes here and there. They drafted Cody Whitehair in 2018 to help that offensive line get better. And of course, they built up the defense to be the number one defense in the NFL in 2018. Like they tried to put together a supporting cast that would be as good as possible for Mitch Trubisky, because at that point they cut Mike Glennon. There's no going back from Mike Glennon. He was always there to be a 1-year starter. That was always going to be the plan. It was a 3-year contract, but the guaranteed money was all structured. So one and done Mike Glennon. This is the Mitch Trubisky show. And so you go into 2018, and it started out a little rough against the Green Bay Packers, which a familiar feeling, but he had that really strong game against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. He throws 6 touchdowns. And a game I'm sure you don't know anything about. You don't remember anything about that game.
I was there for that game, actually. Yeah. I was in the press box for that game, and I remember watching it going, wow, this Bucs team is really bad. And also Mitchell Trubisky ain't too bad.
Yeah, it was working, right? I think it's naive to say everything was great from Mitch all season. The perception was certainly that he was doing fine and that he was doing everything well. And I know the guys at Pro Football Focus received a lot of criticism for grading him fairly average that season, despite the year that the team had as a whole. And it was largely a Bears offense that tried to make Mitch Trubisky's job easier. That's sort of the Matt Nagy offense. It's yards after the catch, West Coast Andy Reid style of offense. So Mitch didn't have to make spectacular throws downfield. He could throw it to Allen Robinson on the 10-yard curl and pick up easy first downs. Or, they were using Tariq Cohen in a lot of creative ways out of the backfield where, you just read your curl flat, your slant flat, and you check it down to the running back, and he turns a negative 2-yard pass into a 12-yard first down. And, Mitch was doing his job, but he wasn't asked to do a lot in that job. And so how good of a season is that from Mitch? I mean, when you try to isolate the quarterback from the rest of the offense, he really wasn't doing a lot of spectacular play, but he was leading them to victories. He was doing his job. He was game managing the way you might expect a second-year quarterback with limited college experience.
Now, I mean, you could be honest about this. At the time, because obviously it's kind of easy now to look back and say, it's the same thing that we do with Carson Wentz, right? A lot of people look back at even Carson Wentz's best year, and that now with hindsight, they go, actually, it probably was a little bit lucky in this regard. And so in the moment when you were watching that season as it was unfolding, were there did you notice those feelings of like, hey, what you're saying now, actually, it wasn't all him. The system was kind of great around him. Was everything coming together? Or were you guys just kind of like, heck yeah, like this is the dude now for Chicago?
It was, so some of both. It felt like it was the next step forward. So it was not like,
that's fair.
It was not Patrick Mahomes year 2, like, oh, all right, give him the keys. It's his car. Let him drive it. He's got his license. But it was like, okay, he's making some more mistakes. That's okay. He's going to need to cut down on those eventually, but he can put up the 6-touchdown game against a bad defense like the Buccaneers. He's capable of that. There were some other stinkers along the way there. Some defenses took advantage of him, but he was, he really had some big success against the Lions that season a couple times. I think the Cowboys maybe later on. There's some of these defenses that didn't challenge him in as many ways as some of the more complex front sevens. And so it was like, all right, this is progress forward. But like you get to the playoff game against the Philadelphia Eagles, that of course the double doink game that Bears fans love to forget. And like Mitch Trubisky was terrible for the first half or 3 quarters of that game, threw some really bad interceptions in the first half. But what we remember from that game is the fourth quarter. 2-minute drive. Trubisky completes 2 or 3 dimes down the sideline to Allen Robinson, sets up a touchdown to bring them up within 3 points, and then drives them down to set up the Cody Parkey potential game-winning field goal that, of course, hits both uprights. So, like, we remember the clutch throws down the stretch. They're like, oh, there's Mitch. There's the quarterback we drafted. Like, carry that into 2019. Sure. Yeah. We saw the flashes in the late moments, and we can clean up those first couple of quarters and kind of slow him down a little bit, make sure he's not trying too much, and help him work through progressions a little bit more as we go along. So further path along the same direction of heading in the right direction, but not there yet.
So then we're not going to go exactly year by year with it, because I really have 2 more areas that I want to talk to you about. The next one is, then when did we see a lot of those wheels start falling off? When did the allurement of, okay, he's young, like you said, this is the next step in the progression. At what point did you go, oh no, like he's not taking that net, like we've stopped progressing. This is no longer we can no longer defend. He's on the path that he's supposed to be on. Instead, he has either hit his ceiling or he has started to regress. When did that really start? Was that 2019, more so in 2020? When did that really begin for him there?
It began actually fairly early in 2019 as the team started to get injured around him. The defense started falling off because they were missing Akeem Hicks. Khalil Mack was in the lineup, but not 100%. They didn't have some of those same studs defensively. And on offense, they started having some offensive line injury issues, and the receivers just weren't quite making as many plays after the catch. And Trubisky gets hurt early on in the season, and Chase Daniel came in against the Vikings and led them to some pretty good offensive success. And then Trubisky comes back in and things start to fall apart a little bit. Really bad game in London against the Raiders right before the bye week. And those were like, okay, now we got some red flags here, some question marks. Then as the season goes on, they go in this long losing streak down the middle of the season. It was 4 or 5 games where things really fell apart halfway through the year. And it's like, okay, we got to ask some real questions here about Mitch Trubisky. But then they start pulling you back in. Again, the Lions defenses under Matt Patricia were always Mitch Trubisky's fixer games.
Yeah, right. I do remember this.
He just tear them up. And, the Bears won some games late in that season. They somehow got back in the playoff conversation and they finished 8-8. They were never a true playoff contender, but like 2019 ends and you're like, well, maybe it was just a terrible set of circumstances in the first half of the year and that everything was falling apart. And how was Mitch supposed to have that much success with everything falling apart? But, maybe the success late in the season was a little bit more of a mirage, and we should have put more stock in the failures they had early on in 2019, because that whole season, I think, really encapsulated some of the denial about Mitch Trubisky and some of the real serious concerns of where they were headed.
So then the next question, and this is really the big Buster broken question. You mentioned a little bit of what Matt Nagy likes to do as a head coach. He likes to make things easy for the quarterback, get the ball out relatively quickly, West Coast style, yards after the catch kind of a guy. When you've seen Mitchell Trubisky struggle over the last 2 years to the point where, there's a good chance he's not in Chicago next year, that his tenure is already over with the Bears. Were there times when you looked at Nagy trying to put a square piece in a round hole, or however you want to say that saying? I know it goes vice versa with people. Was it him trying to make Mitchell Trubisky something he wasn't? Or do we think that Matt Nagy was really tempering his offense because Mitch just could not do something one way or the other?
This was the prime debate of Chicago sports radio for probably the last 24 to 36 months at this point. It's very clearly Mitch having some real limitations, right? And Matt Nagy is not the perfect coach and has had some issues with trying to fit other players into specific round holes. But when it came to Mitch, it felt like they needed to push him, right? It's like, to some extent, you made it easy on him early on, and then as his career goes on, you start to open it up a little bit more and see how he does. Like, that's sort of the part of the progression of the quarterback.
Right.
And every time Matt Nagy tried to open it up a little bit more, Mitch would struggle. I mean, there's a reason why, going into year 4 of his career, Matt Nagy says in the offseason, Mitch needs to become a master of reading coverages. And you'd like to think by this point in his career, he's able to read coverages or not. Like, you kind of either get it at this point or you don't. And he really has trouble.
At least to the point where your head coach isn't coming out and criticizing that part of your game.
Yeah, right. And he wasn't trying to be overly critical. He's just saying, here's where Mitch needs to grow, right? Which is sort of reading between the lines as being critical, but it wasn't completely throwing him under the bus. But every time Matt Nagy tried to open things up a little bit more, Mitch tries too hard. He tries to do too much. You see him rush his footwork. You see him rush his delivery, and you see him really struggle to, understand the full field coverage when he's getting through his progression. When, if he can easily tell that it's man coverage before the snap, he can see it, he can throw it, and he can hit it downfield. But, when it's a zone coverage and he's getting to his 4th receiver crossing the middle of the field, he forgets, or he doesn't realize which zone it is, and there's a defender waiting for him, and he throws the interception right into his arms, and he just never saw the guy because he wasn't quite sure what the coverage was. And so there's only so much a coach can do with that. I think he can still be a winning quarterback in the NFL, but he's a quarterback that's going to need a lot of help to get there. And so that's what I come back to. I come back to bust more than broken. It wasn't a perfect set of scenario for him in Chicago. And if he goes to Kansas City and Patrick Mahomes comes to Chicago, Mitch Trubisky doesn't become Patrick Mahomes in Kansas City. There's a certain inherent lack of ability there and a lack of understanding that maybe could a different coach have taught it to him in a slightly different way to help him get it a little bit better. Maybe, but he's been through multiple quarterback coaches, multiple offensive coordinators, multiple head coaches in Chicago, and it still hasn't quite clicked the way you want it for a number 2 overall pick.
Sometimes you look at that situation, and when there's a lot of change with offensive voices, whether it's quarterback coach or play callers or whatever, you can use that as, I don't want to say an excuse, but that's just something that weighs on a young quarterback's development. But it just seems like every move the Bears have tried to make has been pro Mitchell Trubisky, and yet they can't figure it out with him. And now he's 26 years old. And I agree, his career's not over. Certainly he could pop around the league, be a backup, maybe be a spot starter. But I'm with you. I think we're labeling this first edition of Buster Broken with Mitchell Trubisky as a bust. Is that fair? You said it. I just want to make sure that's fair.
It's fair. You can defend Mitch by pointing to the flaws the Bears had in trying to build around him, missed free agents, missed draft picks, things like that. But at the end of the day, the quarterback is who he is at this point. And I don't know that a different set of circumstances would drastically change what Trubisky has been so far.
And I just don't think that when you draft a quarterback at 2 overall, you can't sit here and go, oh, it wasn't exactly perfect for him to succeed. If you're going 2 overall and you're a quarterback, you got to overcome a lot of that stuff. Lorin Cox, you can see him everywhere. He covers the Bears basically in any form or fashion that you need him to. Lorin, I really appreciate you joining me for this first edition of Buster Broken. You did great, my friend.
Hey, I feel bad for whoever's got to follow up after me. So thank you.
That's the confidence that we love on this show. Hope you guys really enjoyed that. I'm really going to enjoy this format. It's going to be fun. We're going to have a lot more names, a lot of really great guests, and some prospects that we are going to get to the bottom to of whether or not they are bust or broken. We'll see you guys next week.